Hi, everybody. I would like to extend a giant thank you both to Charlie Wishman and also Ken Sager for inviting me to speak to you all today. It has been a very interesting legislative session, and here we are only, I believe, approaching our 5th week. But before we dive into the policy issues, I'd like an opportunity to just talk to you a little bit more about the Iowa State Education Association. Our association is a proud union made up of over 34,000 dues-paying members across the state of Iowa. We represent primarily education professionals, including teachers, members of the area education agencies, education professionals, that would include support staff in the classrooms, secretarial staff, in some situations maintenance and transportation workers, and we also represent full-time community college faculty. And all of these different groups that make up our membership have strong ties to labor and also serve as the backbone of the middle class, frankly, here in Iowa as well as across the country, which is one of the reasons why we have such a good partnership with the Iowa Federation of Labor. Because we care about education policy issues and also because we're a union, we care deeply about labor issues. And Charlie, Ken, and I have had an opportunity to bond over the last 5 years that I've been with the Iowa State Education Association because we have been under attack, both on a labor standpoint and also from an education standpoint. And so those are some of the things we're going to dive in today here in my portion of the presentation. One of the largest conversations that is happening at the state capitol today is over the percentage of growth of basic funding for schools, formerly known as allowable growth, now known as supplemental state aid. We are currently arguing over the funding level that schools are going to receive starting in the September 2016 calendar year. So that's literally, 7 months away now? I can't believe it's already February. By law, the Iowa legislature is supposed to set the amount of SSA, or supplemental state aid as we call it, over 18 months out, which means we're a year behind schedule. This year we should be only dealing with FY 17-18, and instead we're still dealing with FY 16-17. And what this means for school districts, for educators, and for parents of students is that school districts are not currently able to plan adequately because they don't know how many resources they're going to have at their disposal. Hopefully, many of you have seen in the news, whether on television or on the newspaper or in the newspaper or on the internet, the number of school districts that are contemplating how many positions they're going to have to cut, or what types of programs they're going to have to cut back on. How many of you, when you were my age or perhaps a little older, had an opportunity to take a foreign language class in your school? Many of us had that opportunity. How many of us had an opportunity to go to recess when we were in elementary? Did everybody take a gym class? How many of you got to play football or wrestle or basketball or play volleyball, probably starting somewhere 3rd, maybe 5th grade range? That is not happening for all of our students today. And this is something that we all need to care about. Either you care about it because you're a parent, you're a grandparent, you're a guardian, maybe you care about it because you truly do see children as an investment, or investments in children as an investment in our future, or maybe you care about it because you're a taxpayer. But we should all be concerned that there are many students today in Iowa that don't have access to some of the basic programming, or what we thought of as basic programming. We have districts that have decided not to have German or French offered in their classrooms anymore because they can't afford to have those additional staff. We have class sizes now that are in upwards of 35 kids in a classroom that was designed for 26 children. And this is all at a time when we are dealing with changing demographics that make classrooms today look dramatically different than they did when I was attending school in the 80s and the 90s. There are now more than 25 dialects of Swahili spoken in the Cedar Rapids School District alone. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how to speak Swahili. And I didn't get training for Swahili when I was in school, whether it be secondary school or in college. And Swahili is not actually something that's required in our teacher preparation programs. But my members are still required to teach the children who don't speak English, and instead their primary language is a dialect of Swahili. This is all going on at a time when there are many people up at the state capitol who are part of the Republican Party, primarily in the House is what we're dealing with right now, who don't think that we need additional resources invested in public education because those greedy teachers just suck it all up at the bargaining table. Here's the deal. If you want well-educated children, we need to have the resources to do that. And who's the best person to educate those children? A quality educator. You're not going to attract educators, just like any other field, unless you're willing to pay a reasonable salary. In the state of Iowa, we still have districts where the starting salary for an educator is $28,000 a year. Now, we recently passed teacher leadership and compensation legislation, which is a part of an education reform proposal that we frankly had to agree to in order to get a particular level of growth a couple of years ago, that raised that starting salary to $33,500. Is that a significant increase from what the bottom was before? Certainly. Is that still enough if you are an educator living outside of Lynn County? No, it's not. Now, we do have some situations where larger metropolitan areas do allow for a larger increase or minimum salary, but we know that that doesn't apply to the person who's teaching in Osage, Iowa. Right? You're not going to attract a quality educator to Shenandoah if you're not willing to raise your base level of pay. And we have the tremendous honor, but also the obligation to educate over 480,000 public education students across the state. And we need the resources to be able to do that, which is why at the Iowa State Education Association, we are advocating for a 4% allowable growth rate for FY 16-17, as well as a 4% allowable growth rate for FY 17-18. Unfortunately, the FY 16-17 rate that the House Republicans passed, I believe just last week, was 2%. This is after the governor proposed 2.45% in his budget. It seems to be in a particular chamber or a particular political affiliation at the state capitol, it's a race to the bottom. How little can we get by with spending? Our concern is that it's going to cost us a lot more on the back end. If we don't make those investments now, if we don't allow our kids to have access to things like foreign languages, to things like fine arts, access to music, access to recess, access to gym, things that many of us loathed, frankly, when we were students back in the day, these are things that are not even options for some of our students in Iowa now. And unfortunately, if we continue on this path of less than adequate funding in public education, eventually they're going to catch up to us. Something else I'd like to point out, just because for those of you who are grandparents, parents, guardians in the room, maybe you've heard a little bit about third grade retention. Anybody have a student who received a letter that talked about whether or not they were proficient or less than proficient in second grade or third grade reading? Yeah? A couple of you? This is, frankly, the product of a piece of legislation that was passed in 2012, where, again, we had to agree, in order to get some reasonable investments in public education, to entertain the idea of retaining third graders who were less than proficient at the end of their third grade year, unless they went to summer school to attend some intensive reading programs. At that time, the legislation said it was contingent upon funding. Well, here we are, knocking on the doorstep of children being retained during the next school year, and guess whose budget didn't have money for an intensive reading program? The governor's. So we passed these education reform proposals under the guise of making our students better and increasing the proficiency level of our students, and then we don't prioritize that enough to actually make an investment. So what they're going to ask the school districts to do is to do it on their own without any sort of additional resources placed in the system. Can you imagine how expensive summer school is across the state for upwards of 10,000 students who might potentially be retained? When you factor in food programs, when you factor in bringing in maintenance workers, secretarial staff, education professionals, transportation services for a 2-month period that are typically not currently assumed in school districts, we're talking about a substantial amount of money. The department requested $9 million for this program. And the $9 million is not there in anybody's priority budget with the exception of the Senate Democrats. So it's entirely possible that at the end of this upcoming school year, we're going to have a number of students, almost 10,000, that are identified as not being proficient in reading, who will be required to attend summer school without knowing what those summer school programs look like. So people get scary letters in the mail that said your student might not be proficient, we're going to hold your kid back, but we're not going to give you the tools to be able to fix the problem. That's just one example of some of the education policy issues that we're facing up at the state capitol. Some other policies that are very, very troubling, and frankly I think should be issues that we hope when you go back and perhaps attend your legislative forums, we would ask that you would support 4% allowable growth or supplemental state aid when you're talking to your local legislators. But also, please encourage them to stop attempting to privatize public education along with other public services. The number of bills that we register on a weekly basis against, or rather in opposition to, that are attempting to privatize public services, particularly public education, is getting astronomical. There are a number of, again, House Republicans who frankly I believe have been perusing the ALEC. I don't know how many of you are familiar with ALEC, or the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a think tank. It's a place where primarily Republicans are invited to attend and get legislative policy ideas. And they found a couple of new recruits in this latest round of House Republicans. Sorry to be so terribly partisan, but that's what we're dealing with at the State House these days. There is a clear line between who is pro-public education and pro-labor and who is not, and most of them fall along party lines. The privatization attempts, as it applies to education, include expanding opportunities for charter schools. All charter schools in the state of Iowa, of which I believe there are less than 9 now, are required to be public, which means ISEA can go in and bargain those contracts. There are people at the State House who don't like us, shocker that anybody would not like a union up at the Capitol, who want to enable private agencies to come in and run those programs, for-profit organizations to run those programs. And if you're a charter, there's less accountability than if you're a public school or school district. And the reason why is because it would be probably less expensive in their estimation, and also under the guise of parental freedom. It's the same reason they've proposed voucher legislation under the guise of educational savings accounts. We've seen this legislation pop up over the last 3 years. Doesn't an educational savings account sound like a good idea? Kind of sounds like something a responsible person would do, right? Save money for education. What it would do is it would take the per pupil funding amount, which is approximately just shy of $7,000 right now at this point, and it would enable a parent to decide where they're going to spend that, let's say, $6,500. So if you wanted to, you could use that to send your child to a parochial school, or you could keep that money and use it to homeschool your student. And if you didn't spend all that money, you could put it into a savings account for further education. That's not good use of taxpayer dollars, and that's also not investing in public services or public education, and doesn't help us provide a quality, equitable education to every student across the state of Iowa, regardless of their zip code. Sorry, I'm talking too long, I can tell. But from the labor side of things, I just have to tell you about a very exciting meeting I had at 10 o'clock this morning. Subcommittee today was on House File 2115. And this bill is interesting in particular because it's going after Public Employee Unions Association leave. Turns out, apparently somebody got themselves in a bunch because they didn't like it when union members, public employee union members, came up to the state capitol and lobbied on behalf of their association's missions and values. And so they don't think that we should have access to association labor. If we do, taxpayers should not be on the hook for it. Well, the way it works with the Iowa State Education Association is this is a local control issue. When you sit down with a school district at the bargaining table, in some situations the district agrees to pick up the expense. In other situations, the union reimburses the district for the cost of hiring a substitute teacher, for example, or a substitute paraeducator. They did not care that the state is not always on the hook for this expense. They also did not understand the mutually beneficial nature of association leave. Often our contracts are bargained in a fashion that would enable, which by the way, this is a mandatory topic of bargaining, that they just want to yank out of Chapter 20, which we are absolutely not in favor of, and for any of you who are parts of public employee unions, you wouldn't be in favor of either, I would assume. But we use those association days, which can be as few as 2, as many as 10. Again, it's a local control issue. We use those days to do professional development. We use those days to do advocacy. And often that advocacy is, again, mutually beneficial for both the association and also the school district in our circumstances. But because they think that is egregious, it is not a good use of taxpayer-funded dollars, even though they couldn't tell you exactly where the cost was coming to individuals at the state, they have decided to schedule another subcommittee on this bill. Now, this morning, it was 10 o'clock on a Monday, not a terribly popular time at the state capitol, and the only people in the room were registered in opposition to this bill. There is one person representing an organization registered in favor of this bill. Anybody have a guess as to who that might be? The only person registered in favor of this bill is the lobbyist for a group called Americans for Prosperity, which is a Koch brothers organized advocacy arm that is very active here in the state of Iowa. Now, this is not lost on any of us who are registered against this bill, as is the IFL, AFSCME. I believe the building trades are also registered in opposition to this bill. All of us are lining up explaining what the importance of association leave is. And we know that the privates are standing there with us too, because when they come for public, who do you think they're coming for next, right? This is about diminishing the power of labor, of organized labor, period. And that is only one example. And they're not even hiding it anymore. When Drew Klein, who's the lobbyist for Americans for Prosperity, is literally the only person registered in favor of this bill, and by the way, doesn't even bother to show up at the subcommittee to speak on it, to talk about why they're in favor of it, it just lets you know the daily battle that Charlie and Ken and I face up at the Capitol, along with many other wonderful advocates of all the organizations that you all belong to. Just one example of some of the actions that we face up at the state capitol. One other thing that I would throw out there as an example, let's see, last week or was it the week before, we got to be at a subcommittee where somebody wanted to make sure that the teachers had a statewide bargaining agreement. No longer will we bargain with school districts, we would just bargain with the Department of Administrative Services. Now, which salary schedule do you think we're going to follow? Probably not going to be the $45,000 starting schedule, salary schedule of the Des Moines Public School System. Probably going to look a little closer to the one that's negotiated in Shenandoah, where if you're lucky, a first-year teacher gets paid $28,500. Right? So this is the environment that we are facing, which is why it's so important that all of our organizations come together, that we stand strong up the state capitol, and that when we have an opportunity, we go back to our home districts as constituents of these elected officials and ask them to support policies that make investments in public services, that make investments in maintaining a middle class. That includes things like addressing minimum wage issues, which I get the impression you're going to hear about a little bit later, which includes protecting resources set up to fund those public services. Some of you might have heard about some policy efforts that have been proposed to divert the 1 cent sales tax away from school infrastructure and put it into water conservation. What does that mean for our schools? That means there will eventually be some school districts that can't replace their HVAC system, right? Who might not be able to update their infrastructure. Well, who does the updating of that infrastructure, by the way? Who do you think we contract to build those buildings? To take care of our electrical work, to take care of our plumbing services, right? And when they divert these resources, not only are they reneging on an agreement they made with taxpayers, but they are also shorting the resources set aside for public services, including public education in particular. So I would be happy to take questions. I swear I did nothing new or different. I don't know what happened. Does anybody have any questions about education or labor policy? We keep track to the best of our ability. That is not something that has to be a matter of public record, but it has been estimated that there are no fewer than 28% of the House Republicans that homeschool their children. Unfortunately, most of them were appointed to the House Education Committee, which really, really weights things not in our favor. I can look around the room, in my head, I'm looking around the room right now, and over 50% of the House Republicans that sit on the House Education Committee either currently homeschool or have previously homeschooled their children. And there are 2 in the Senate Education Committee, Republicans that homeschool their children actively now.
And is Bill Wise currently working for the governor as an education? And he's advocating probably charter schools and this kind of development. But let's keep in mind some of our friends, and I don't forget the Gang of 8, that help implement this, that snuck it in an omnibus bill about charter schools. And but really, to the nuts and bolts of it is that there's some play on black and white communities, and that, you know, that black communities will have a chance to improve their education, but not build an infrastructure for a public education, which is a total farce. And how is that playing out in the Iowa House right now?
So is this just utterly obnoxious, or I can yell?
Here.
Okay.
Try that.
Okay, so thank you for that question, John. John mentioned a gentleman by the name of Phil Wise, who I'll take the shame for. Actually, he was a disgruntled member of the Iowa State Education Association. Sorry. I don't think it had anything to do with us. But yeah, no, he is actually the legislative liaison now for the Department of Education, part-time, and the other half-time he works for the Board of Educational Examiners. He also happens to be a close personal friend with Representative Cecil Dolachek, who is the chair of the House Education Appropriations Committee, who's a Republican. So yes, Phil does work for the governor's administration, and he does not actively advocate for charter schools, but he is one example of someone who is very good at trying to gin up different ways to come up with innovative solutions to address public education issues. And it can often provide an opportunity for some division amongst some of our friends. Please don't misunderstand. There are Democrats who are not who are interested in pursuing education reforms, again, under the guise of innovation. But one of the ways in which I think we become vulnerable to attempts to further privatize public services is for people who are anti-union, frankly, to go in, identify a particular problem, and then come up with some pre-packaged privatized solution to solve this problem. This becomes more attractive when you are in the process of starving out a system, right? We're not vulnerable when we have adequate funding. We are not vulnerable when we have ample supports to be able to carry out and do our jobs. Well, when they tried to do this 5 years ago, we were a bit more resilient. Starve us out, don't give us adequate funding for the last 6 years. We're about to approach a 7th year of inadequate funding, and all of a sudden, we're a little softer, right? We're a little bit more vulnerable. It's harder for us to say, no, we don't need those resources. It's harder for us to say, don't divert those resources from professional development, for example, to give it more to the general fund. When you have systematically done what you can to, frankly, put a stranglehold on this public service. And so there are vulnerabilities, but that's why we're working as hard, frankly, to advocate for adequate investments and to shore ourselves up with people who should be supportive of public education and not allow for some other outside conservative entity to play on our differences to exploit the system.
Melissa, what is the per pupil allotment for each school district gets per pupil?
Per pupil, so when you're talking about educational savings accounts, it's we kind of figure about $6,900. But if you look at the national rankings, NEA, my mothership organization, National Education Association, will be releasing their rankings, and we're somewhere just above 10,000 per pupil when you factor in all of the categoricals and the general aid funding. I will mention that even at that level, we are still $1,155 behind the national average for per pupil investment in the state of Iowa.
So in essence, when people homeschool and when they do the online classes, that takes that amount of money out of each school district, correct?
So when you're homeschooling your student, you don't currently get those resources. If you are a homeschool assistance pupil who, let's say, primarily receives their homeschooling at their home, but then utilizes school district resources to participate in other activities or take maybe an English honors class, for example, or to get chemistry experience, when you're half and half, you get about 1/3 of that funding, depending upon what your coursework looks like. If you are enrolled in one of the online pilot projects that we have, for example, Clayton Ridge and CAM school districts are 2 pilot organizations that utilize privatized services for exclusively online school. You do receive that full amount of per pupil funding, or the school district does, and then moves the lion's share of that on to a for-profit company. The one is Connections Academy and the other is K-12 Inc. They're both publicly traded. Perhaps they're a part of your 401k investments.
Okay.
Sorry, that was crabby.
Accurate, though.
One point that I question is a lot of the school districts, there's some that don't get the same funding throughout the state. Davenport's been going through a big uprising over this recently, that's where we're from. And why the discrepancy of the school district of Davenport compared to other areas?
So without getting too weedy, there are a number of weightings that factor into the amount of funding that perhaps a school district will receive. You get additional weightings depending upon the student bodies that you serve. So there is a higher level of weighting. For example, if you have children who are English language learners, there's a higher level of weighting that a school district receives if they have increased transportation expenses, for example. What the Davenport situation is they are not able to spend all of the resources that they have in the fashion that they would like to spend it. And that is actually something that is not, unfortunately, unique to Davenport. We have a school finance formula that our state functions under, and it is rampant with inequities. And those inequities, frankly, are only growing, again, as our demographics continue to change across the state. As school districts are consolidated, transportation needs increase greatly. The expense also increases greatly. We have some kids in this state that spend 75 minutes on a school bus each direction because they live in the boonies, frankly, and they have to get to a quality education program somewhere, hopefully within a 5 or 6 county radius. That district is going to, frankly, cost more, and the weightings that they receive for that expense do not keep pace with the expense. And so that has perpetuated some inequities in the system. If you have a lot of English language learners in your district, you're receiving an additional 0.2% of weighting. That 0.2 is not enough, frankly, to cover the expense of educating those children. We have been advocating for increased weightings to address some of these situations. We've also advocated for some proposals to address these inequities. And it's a big, heavy lift. It's a detailed lift, and it's hard to go about trying to correct these inequities without shorting some other area that also needs attention. And so we are hopeful that if we can have a very successful, frankly, political session, and again, I don't want to get overly political, that we might be able to find some people up at the state capitol who are pro-public education and are interested in addressing some of these problems and inequities perpetuated by the school funding formula, that aren't going to do it in a fashion that actually takes money out of the system. A lot of the current proposals to attempt to get at inequities actually try to de-invest those resources or take resources that are already funding an existing portion of our school finance and want to move it. We are not advocates of stealing from Peter to pay Paul, quite frankly. But we are actively working on different ways that we can address the Davenport situation in particular and inequities across the board.
Do you have any opinion about the ICN?
Sure. I have lots of opinions about lots of different things. The ICN is something that I think if it had been adequately funded and used, could be something that is very valuable. But it's a state resource that I think received a number of investments. But then people were not hello? Nope. People weren't encouraged to use it, and so it was something that wasn't able to die out. We've seen other programs like that. Iowa Learning Online, for example, is an online-based learning opportunity, education opportunity for kids. So again, I hate to pick on Shenandoah, but if you're in Shenandoah and you would like to take an advanced placement chemistry class, you might not be able to have access to that in your home district. But you can go use things like the ICN or Iowa Learning Online, for example, to have access to a teacher, an Iowa licensed teacher, perhaps over in the Quad Cities in Davenport, right, who teaches this class and gives you exposure to this opportunity. But if we don't fund those opportunities, and if we don't drive business to them, if we don't incentivize school districts to use those services, what good does it do us? One other thing I want to mention is, if anybody has any other questions, is I'm sorry, I didn't talk too much about our community college faculty. In the governor's proposal, after a year of no funding, right? So he held last year's community colleges at FY15 funding level, so they saw no increase. Excuse me. He is advocating for $3.1 million to be spread across 15 community colleges in the state of Iowa. That's after we already have the 8th highest tuition rate at community colleges across the country. Now, for those of us that have family members, significant others, who are trying to go back and get additional skills to have jobs with all of these organizations that claim to be underemployed, right? Or they can't go out and find skilled workers right now. How do we make it so Iowans can go out and get the training, frankly, that they need to fill these positions? You're not going to be able to do it if you're charging an outrageous amount of tuition at the community colleges. But because they have a mechanism, which is to increase tuition, to offset the expense of community college, which would require less of a state investment, that's the meager proposal that he has included in his budget. I would not be surprised when we see the House Republicans' budgetary numbers to see absolutely no increase for community colleges for a second year in a row. And I will be working closely with Senate Democrats to ensure that they fight for a greater deal of funding for community colleges. Those are our neighbors. Those are our family members. Those are people who are trying to get the skills to fill the positions that we know, or here, apparently, there are so many opportunities for. Those are apprenticeship programs. Those are skills that our folks need. And again, what is it? It's the backbone of the middle class. It's a living wage. It's a good wage. It hopefully comes along with benefits, and we need to make sure people have access to those opportunities. And so we'll be fighting for that as well.
Any other questions? Well, please thank Melissa for being